My name is Dr. Tanya Harmer. I'm an Associate Professor in the Department of International History, and I teach Latin American history, mostly 20th century Latin American history. HY44 is about the Cold War in Latin America, very broadly defined. So on one level, it's a history of Latin America during the 20th century, focusing particularly on ideological and political conflicts in the region. So we look at the history of revolution, we look at the spread of Marxist ideology, we look from the impact of the Bolshevik Revolution through the Cuban Revolution and Nicaraguan revolutions. We also look at the rise of anti-communism as a powerful language and framing device in Latin America in the early part of the 20th century, military dictators, counter-revolution and counter-insurgency. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, the Cold War in Latin America course, HY444, is a course about the history of Latin America in the 20th century. So we explore historiography, we explore different methodological and disciplinary approaches to understanding the past. So on one level we look at the governments and states and kind of power structures, but we also look at everyday life, how the Cold War intersected with ideas of gender, race, culture in the region. And a broader theme in historiographical terms that we concentrate on is the transnational dimensions of the Cold War, the way in which people moved across borders and ideas moved across borders. We look at international and also global dimensions of this conflict in the region. The course is structured chronologically and it goes roughly from the end of the 19th century up to the 1990s, going from the golden age of export-led capitalism in Latin America to the impact of the Bolshevik Revolution, to the revolutionary nationalism after World War II, the Cuban Revolution and so forth. But it is interspersed with a number of thematic and global topics. So we spend a few weeks where we kind of step away from the chronology and really think more broadly and analytically about certain themes. For example, comparative revolutions, how revolutions in Latin America compared to revolutions that were taking place in Africa and also in Asia, the Algerian Revolution, the Vietnam Revolution. We also look at how Latin America fitted in with kind of US global counterinsurgency programs, ideas about modernization theory and things like that. And we spend some time looking at direct intervention and connections between Latin America and the wider world. For example, Cuban intervention in Africa, in Angola, in Ethiopia, and also kind of the transnational networks that were formed between exiles and solidarity activists in the 70s, 60s and 70s as a result of the rise of the dictatorships that took place in the region. So really through understanding Latin America's place within these networks, we get a sense of Latin America's place within, narratives like the rise of the global human rights discourse in the 1970s and 80s. The students will benefit mostly from understanding, getting a better understanding of Latin America in the 20th century and the political and ideological conflicts that shaped the region. It is a graduate seminar, so as I said, it's quite intensive. We have 2-hour intensive lively discussions and students are graded on their participation in class, as well as weekly reading reports, written reading reports in which they engage and discuss, analyse the literature and sources that we're discussing as well. So they will benefit from getting a better understanding of Latin America, but also getting a better understanding of the historian's craft, of the way in which historians look at the past and try to grapple with what went on. And when we're dealing with things like the incredible levels of violence and conflict, whether it be the Southern Cone military dictatorships or the genocidal violence in Guatemala, it's very important that we as historians think about how we're actually thinking and framing and retelling this past. It's really impossible to understand Latin America today without having an understanding of its recent past. I think partly this is because the Cold War, as it manifested itself in the region, was very rarely cold. It was often very violent. It had very tangible and significant consequences for everyday life, society, politics and culture. And so the region, in many respects, is still living with the legacies and the consequences, and also grappling with how to understand the past and the legacies of that past. So that's one benefit. I think when we think of Latin America today and we think of some of the central kind of key issues that are shaping politics in the region, whether it be from Cuba and the question marks over US-Cuban relationship, or whether it be about the Colombian peace process, you can't really begin to grapple and understand those without having an understanding of their origins, which are rooted really very much in the Cold War context. So that is kind of one of the key benefits I hope students will gain from this course. I think another thing is to say that Latin America is very often studied and understood as being a region separate from other parts of the world. And this is rather ahistorical, especially when we think about the 20th century, because if we think of the kind of global dimensions of the Cold War struggle in Latin America, or the way that Latin America has intersected with other parts of the world during the Cold War, we get a much better sense of Latin America's place within the world and how we, students, historians, should really begin to start thinking about its place in a broader global context.